With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right, even if the whole world is telling you to move, it is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Tactics, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. Thank you so much for being with us here on the program, here in the Situation Room. As always, we are glad that you have chosen to make us a part of your day, regardless of how you're joining us, Twitter, Twitch, Facebook, the terrestrial signal, however you're listening to this. We appreciate you being a part of the program. As we have been doing for the past 3 weeks now, really, we are going to start with our Alabama coronavirus update. So we'll go ahead and bring up the latest from the Alabama Department of Public Health. This is their tracker, and you can see a couple of really interesting things I want to note here. The total coronavirus cases for the Wuhan flu, 2,197. So it's interesting that we're always right under a round number. We were actually at 1,999 yesterday. We're at just barely under 2,200 today. And one of the reasons that this is quite concerning is that is a plus 198 since yesterday, which is a pretty significant single-day gain. And another thing that's quite alarming is that the deaths have been not outrageous from one day to the next, but they've been slowly ratcheting up the past several days, and that is something to truly be worried about. The crazy thing, though, is that the strangest thing about today's report is if you'll look at the number tested, which you can see on the screen there is 14,765, the thing that's very odd about that is that that's exactly the same number of tests that we had yesterday. So I'm not sure exactly what's going on there. I don't know if they had some kind of hiccup to the point to where their system went down and they just couldn't report any new tests. It's really hard to tell with something like this. And remember, this thing seems as though, because, you know, it feels like forever since I went out and did something. And I know for a lot of you, especially those of you that are self-quarantining like I am, it feels like this is happening at a snail's pace. However, the thing that you have to remember about this is only one day where they haven't done any testing. And while that's certainly significant, and we need to get to the bottom of why that is taking place, just to add a little bit of perspective, it is possible that their computer system just went down for a few hours and they weren't able to record the new tests that they have done. It's also possible that at least several of the testing facilities were unable to report for some kind of other technical issue. It's possible that some of them had to close down. There's a number of different explanations, and some may be understandable and some may not be so understandable, but it really makes sense to hold out on judgment before we go ahead and start jumping to conclusions. I think that jumping to conclusions is something that's very easy to do in a crisis situation like this, but there may be a very good explanation for why that took place. It looks to me most likely that it's just some kind of technical error that either they didn't get reported or did get reported, but were not recorded in the system for whatever reason. I'm guessing that's what's happening. I find it hard to believe that every single testing site in Alabama, which is a few dozen at this point, all simultaneously went down on the same day, or that they all simultaneously had too many cases and were backed up and had to... So I'm not sure. And I know that that's frustrating when you want the answers and you come here for them. I get that. But right now, it would not do me or anybody else any good to speculate. Let's wait a day, see what happened, see what all is going on, and the reason that no more tests have been brought forward since the time of this show yesterday. I was actually waiting and kind of hoping that they would get that problem solved and fixed since the show started a little bit later today than it did yesterday, and unfortunately that was not the case. The thing that is sort of disappointing, though, and like I said, this is a number that isn't necessarily good or bad one way, but it's something that gives us sort of an indication of how many people are being tested and positive for it. If you compare this rate of testing to rate of confirmed cases amongst people being tested, we've talked about this number before. Usually a normal number, a normal range, we're usually looking at somewhere between about an 11 and a 13. So somewhere in that range is pretty normal. It was a little high yesterday at 13.5. Well, now that we have added almost 200 more cases and have not added a single test, had zero gain on the testing side, as you can imagine, that percentage got significantly worse. So what we're at now is a 14.8% of those tested coming back positive, which means there is very likely, I mean, if you can round that up to 15, that's really scary, but here's the thing you have to remember. This is the thing that you have to understand. How did they get almost 200 more confirmed coronavirus cases if they weren't testing? I mean, maybe they just had a whole bunch of tests yesterday and the results of those tests came back today. And I'm not saying that couldn't be a contributing factor, but it seems very strange to me that you have new cases of coronavirus yet didn't do any test for coronavirus. That doesn't make any sense. So what's more likely happening is that the numbers somehow didn't get updated or didn't get refreshed, or the reporting of the testing numbers, maybe there was some kind of error in them and they weren't sure if they were correct or not. And so before they added any more, they had to go back and double check. There's a myriad of different reasons why this is. It is unlikely that we didn't actually do any tests today. It is more likely that for some other reason, the number that is being reported is different than the number that we actually have being tested in the state of Alabama today. That seems to be what is actually going on here. Now, with that in mind, let's go ahead and I'm going to kind of, that's going to be what I'm going to say about the testing, since, you know, there is no new data, so it wouldn't do a whole lot of good for us to dwell on that. Let's go ahead and look at this instead, at the confirmed cases of Alabama. Now, again, this is the number that we were just talking about that went up by about 200 yesterday. We're at just barely under 2,200 cases in the Yellowhammer State. You'll notice that that increase is slightly less than yesterday if you're looking at the right-hand side of your graph there. And still a gain, still going in an upward trajectory, certainly not where you want to be. But again, and I know that I've been saying this every day for the past few days because we were expecting a significant spike, no spike has happened. Numeric increases, yeah. Some more than others, sure. Still something to be concerned about? Absolutely. But no spike. So that is good news. We're not seeing rates get up into, you know, you're having 1,000 cases one day and the next day you wake up and you've got 2,000 cases. We haven't seen something like that, and thank God that we haven't. But ultimately, what this means is we're still seeing that pattern of numeric increasing, and I think what's going on here, because we really should have seen a spike by this point, based on the models and based on data that we have from other countries, Italy, South Korea, Europe, Italy, South Korea, other parts of Europe like Spain. Also, yes, China, I'm a little more skeptical of their data because they tend to not be the most honest. I mean, they're lying about this is what got us into this mess in the first place. So I'm a little skeptical of their data. However, what we're looking at now and what we are understanding from what we are seeing is that as far as the numeric spike where we just get ridiculous levels of cases and our confirmed cases doubling or tripling in a single day, and it doing that for a week or two on end until you've got a big chunk of the population with this thing, that's just not what we're seeing right now. It is just not what we're seeing. And so by understanding that, that's something to at least celebrate. And it seems that what we are doing is working at quote unquote flattening the spike. And it seems as though that it's having some kind of positive effect, which is really good. Now, the thing that is concerning, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is that the death toll is getting on up there. And that's not a good place to be, obviously. And if you're looking at the 39 deaths that we have, and these are the ones that we have confirmed, we know for sure were caused by the coronavirus. The deaths reported are, of course, a little bit higher. They're in the 60s, but we're just not sure how many of those were coronavirus related, how many of them weren't, how many of them were coronavirus, but also other conditions played into that. I don't know. So we're just going to deal with what we know for a fact, deaths that we know are attributed to the coronavirus, which, of course, was 39 today. And if you look at that compared to our cases in the state of Alabama, that puts us at a 1.8 lethality rate, which is pretty high. We were expecting about a 1% lethality rate. And if this thing is just proving to be more fatal in Alabama than other places, there's a few possible explanations for it. I still think what's going on is that we don't quite have enough data, but there are a couple of explanations. First of all, Alabama happens to be a state that is older than most. Granted, we don't hold we don't hold a candle to Florida maybe, but we have somewhat, we are a older on average population than most states if you compare them side by side. Another thing that is going to be an issue here is that Alabama has a higher rate of smokers than most places. Granted, our smoking rate isn't like Italy's or China's, which is significantly worse than ours. But if you're looking and comparing us to other states, we do tend to have a higher smoking population. There's a lot of people in Alabama that have other conditions with them. For example, obesity is a problem in Alabama at a rate that's higher than most states. And what does that typically lead to? Heart and lung problems, which also contribute to, you guessed it, the Wuhan virus. So there's a number of factors that may be the cause for that rate of fatality. It is also possible that that rate is somewhat inflated. I mean, especially considering we're looking at this on a day where we didn't even get a single report turned in of people testing for the coronavirus. I find it a little bit jumping the gun, a little bit too eager to jump onto a narrative without hanging back and looking at exactly what happened there and trying to figure out what all this why all this is happening when we're in the middle of it. I know that you've got to somewhat observe this as it's going on because to be frank about this whole situation, it's basically that we're in a plane and we're trying to repair the plane as the plane is falling out of the sky. And I know that that's a very scary metaphor, and it's not like we're plummeting and we have to fix the plane within the next few seconds. It's more like we've got a little time left, but we got to do something to fix the plane, and we can't land to fix it. We've got to do it while she's in the air. And so that's what we're trying to do here, all of us in the media and everybody else. We're just trying to gobble up as much information when we can get it and try to sort of smack it together and shape it into something that makes sense to us and helps us understand that data. Some people, of course, are better at it than others. I like to think that I'm at least okay at it. But based on everything right now, I think that it would be foolhardy to assume that the actual death rate of this thing is close to 2% in the state of Alabama. There's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, like I said, there is a argument of ignorance here, and I know that that's a logical fallacy, but I'm not trying to argue saying that it necessarily means that it's not that. I'm just saying that there is a lack of substantial data, which means that we don't know, which means that it could be inflated. For all we know, it could actually be higher than 1.8%, but with an incomplete set of data, that's very, very difficult to determine. Now, the second part of that, and the second reason why this may be giving us an artificially inflated number, is that typically when a pandemic hits, and it is something that has a decent rate of fatalities that are associated with that, you have to also remember that the people that are more likely to die from it are also the people that are more likely to get infected with it in the first place. For example, who does this virus affect? People with immunodeficiency. Okay, well, those are also the people that are most likely to get infected if a virus is going around. Who else is more at risk? People over 60 years old, who are also more susceptible to viruses when they come around. And you also have to consider, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, that there are studies out now. There was one that was done, I believe, in France, that they are looking at part of their population, and they are seeing that there are significant amounts of their population that are asymptomatic. And that's another thing that we're looking at, that the data from this thing and the really understanding how it's all coming in and what it all means has been really fascinating. For example, there is a recent study that suggests that it affects men more than women, which I'm sure drove the trans community just straight up a wall. Like, you identifying as a man, if you don't have man parts and you're not a man, is not in any way going to endanger you, nor is doing the opposite, being a man and claiming to be a woman, going to protect you from the virus. Because guess what? Science doesn't care about your feelings either. You could feel like a woman, like Shania Twain, not going to make a difference. If men are more susceptible to it, your male body is going to be more apt to have this thing harm you. That's just the way that it works. Facts don't care about your feelings. But ultimately, when you look at this and you understand that as many as 50% of the people out there, according to some studies, may be completely asymptomatic, that the 50% of the people that actually have the virus, they've got it, but they're also not symptomatic, well, at the very least, that would cut down on the rate of fatalities by about half if a lot of these people aren't getting tested, which would put it within the 1% margin, which is what a lot of the doctors that are putting these models together had predicted, which, by the way, there was some good news out of the White House that they have actually downgraded the predicted numbers of people that are going to pass away with this thing, which was good. Part of it was because of mitigation. Part of it was because of new information that has come out. But now they're looking at somewhere under 100,000, somewhere closer to like 80 or 50. So something that really is, I don't know, a ray of sunshine in a very dark place, I guess would be the way to say it. That many Americans perishing and losing their lives with this thing, especially when it very easily could have been prevented by the communist nation of China. That's of little consolation, but at the same time, if at least it's not as bad as we thought that it could be. But ultimately, this is where we are, is that we're all trying to figure this thing out while we're in the middle of it, and it's very, very difficult to do that. Life comes at you fast. And this is the reason why it's so important to, A, know who you are and know who your neighbors are and know who everybody else is and understand the world, because you don't want to have to figure out more than you really have to in the middle of this pandemic. And I know that that was somewhat vague, and I know that you probably need a little bit of explanation, but ultimately what's going on here is this is the reason that it's important to anchor yourself to something. Now, I would recommend that you do so based on the gospel of Jesus Christ, but ultimately you have to anchor yourself on to something, because if you don't know who you are in a crisis, then you're going to lose yourself. Because typically what happens is that people do not rise to an occasion. In other words, you're not a decent person that rises to the level of a hero when you are faced with some kind of cataclysmic event. What crises do is they reveal who you already were at the time. You rise to the level of your preparedness. And some of us have noticed in this crisis, and I'm including myself in this, that maybe we aren't as well prepared as we thought we were when it comes to things like food or money, making sure that your personal finances are in order, making sure that your family, if you have one, knows what to do. These are things that you may have thought that you had pretty well figured out, and you realize because of the situation that you just don't. I hope that in a time like this, that there are not a lot of people that are looking at this situation and having to figure out who they are. And I mean that from a spiritual standpoint. Because, as Charles Dickens said in A Tale of Two Cities, these are the times that try men's souls. You don't want to have to learn on the job when it comes to being prepared for something like this. And it's going to be a trial, and there's going to be some curveballs thrown your way whenever some kind of big wave of adversity hits you. I mean, that's how it works. Even the most prepared person is occasionally going to be caught off guard, and that's just a very human thing. We're finite individuals with limited knowledge, and so that occasionally happens. But when it comes to the big questions, you have to know who you are, because that is going to be something you don't want to have to figure out here. If you already know who you are, know what you're about, know what you believe, and know what you're going to do, if you have that moral code, that moral compass at your core that guides you, then you're a lot less likely to falter when you're faced with this kind of adversity. And I think that that's really where we as a state and a nation, and in a lot of ways the world, are right now, is we're at one of these crossroads where we're going to have to figure out who we are and what we believe. And those that are already there, or at least already most of the way there, and know who they are at their core, are going to be a lot better off than those that are just kind of drifting. And that's why I actually think this next story is so important. I was aroused from my sleep this morning. And by the way, I'm just picking at him because I don't mind it at all. And goodness knows, since the mornings have been a little bit without structure, it really didn't hurt me to get up an hour early and do something. So Kevin Elkins, my friend and colleague here at News Radio 1440, who runs the morning show on News Radio 1440, he called in and asked me to discuss a story, and I had some time to look back and research it. So you may recall yesterday that we were talking about over the weekend, on Friday specifically, that Governor Ivey not only issued a way to motivate people to adhere to the guidelines that she was giving when it came to the stay-at-home order, and that motivation, which I thought was just brilliant by her, was, look, y'all, we got to make sure we have a football season, so we need to go ahead and get this done now so we can have football later. I mean, in Alabama, that's just an automatic win for me. And then it topped it all off with reading a Bible verse. And if I'm not mistaken, the Bible verse that she specifically read was Isaiah 39, 1 through 3. I recognize the verse. I'd have to go back and look up the book, chapter, and verse. But essentially it was about not being afraid and putting your trust in God. And that somewhat alludes to the little sermonette that I just gave a few minutes ago. So, in reaction to this, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and you would think that they would have enough sense to, if nothing else, just avoid public ire, shut up during this whole thing where we've got more important things to worry about. The Freedom from Religion Foundation wrote a strongly worded letter, which I'm sure Governor Ivey was terrified of, to Governor Ivey, asking her to stop using her office to promote religion. There's several reasons why this is so patently absurd. First of all, I don't even think that it would necessarily be it wouldn't be a constitutional violation, because Governor Ivey is A, not a member of Congress, and B, not an employee of the federal government. She works for the state of Alabama, which, if you understand your 10th Amendment and understand federalism, doesn't apply to the states anyway. But even if you ignore that, even if you were to assume that she were a federal employee, if she were, for example, one of our representatives, if she were Martha Roby or Mo Brooks or somebody like that, saying this exact same thing. There's a couple reasons why this would in no way be a separation of church and state issue. The Freedom from Religion Foundation, if you've never heard of them, they're basically the ambulance chasers of the constitutional law world. They just sort of wait for something that ticks them off, and when they do, despite the fact that it has no connection with them whatsoever, they just sort of run after it, hoping that somebody will pursue a lawsuit with them and that has standing, even though in their case, they really haven't issued any lawsuits in a while, or at least not to the rate that they used to. And I think that especially with this one, the reason that they sent a letter instead of a lawsuit is that they realize that they've got no case. And if they did try to bring this before a court, if they tried to enact some kind of civil suit against Governor Ivey for abusing the power of her office and using her bully pulpit, essentially, her position as the governor, if she wanted to use that in some way to proselytize and bring people to Christ and promote her religion, first of all, they would have no case in doing so, and they know that that thing would wind up going nowhere, which is the reason that they decided basically to ignore it. They wrote a letter that said that they were mad about it, but that was about the extent of it, because they know that they've got nothing. But the second half of that, when it comes to the Constitution, even if Governor Ivey had said this exact same thing, the words of Isaiah, first of all, are Jewish, not even Christian. Now, of course, the Christians believe that the Old Testament is the law of Moses, and then also the other books from the prophets that are handed down, that they are inspired writings and that they are sacred. But ultimately, there is nothing, at least in that passage that she read, that mentions Jesus or talks about becoming a Christian, anything, because Christianity wasn't a thing at that point. And so the second half, first of all, there's no way you could make an argument that she was trying to convert people using her office of governor, even if you did believe that that would be a problem with the First Amendment. The second half of that, which I find utterly hysterical, is that in their letter, they actually specifically called the Constitution a godless document that was completely secular. And I'm just looking at these people as like, did none of them read any of the notes from James Madison, the transcripts that surrounded the Constitution? Did they not understand and look at the purpose of the founders, the reason that colonizers came to this country in the first place? Look, I've done 1,000 segments on the Christian roots of the nation, so I'm not going to go into great depth in that. That's actually part of what I shared on Kevin Elkin's show Decisions this morning when he called me in and asked me to comment on it. The larger issue here is, it's so hilarious to me that they believe that the Constitution is a godless document, that it is something that is completely secular. It shows their extreme ignorance of history. It shows their extreme ignorance of constitutional law. And it also shows an extreme lack of logic. Here's what I mean by that. Secularism is a worldview. It is a competing religion for Christianity. And what I find hilarious about this is the people that are the Freedom from Religion Foundation, they act as though they must prevent any person of faith from even talking about their faith, even in a way that does not in any way constitute an establishment of religion. Kay Ivey used Isaiah in a speech to encourage people to not be afraid. What if she had read a poem, not of religious nature at all? What if she had read a poem from some kind of famous poet, you know? What if she had read something from Shakespeare? What if she had quoted, a famous movie or something? I'm sure that they would have no problem with that. They would have no problem with that at all. Why is it when she quoted a Bible verse, a verse from the book of Isaiah, which is actually predates Kay Ivey's religion, why is it that all of a sudden reading an inspirational quote from this particular book becomes a violation of the Constitution? See, the irony here is secularism, seeing the world through a worldly lens, Kay Ivey using the words of a person, a human being, which may very well have been inspiring. I'm not saying that there aren't human writings that aren't. There's several that I think are. But if she had done that, that would have been perfectly acceptable to them, because that fits into their worldview. They are a competing religion. And as long as something comports with their religion, they're okay with an elected official doing that. They're not okay with it when somebody uses something out of a religious text, even if they're not using it to try to convert people, even if they're just using it saying, like Governor Ivey did, don't be afraid, don't panic, trust in the Lord. I mean, that's something that comes directly out of the book of Isaiah. Why is it okay to read a secular passage but not a religious one, even if the purpose of both is to inspire people not to be afraid? Ultimately, it comes down to this. They are the competing religion, and they think it's okay for the state to proselytize people in the name of their religion, just not yours. They essentially want to create a secular theocracy, where the state favors secularism over all other worldviews, and if anybody wants to in any way serve or be a part of that hierarchy, that power structure of the government, they have to forego their religious beliefs in order to do so. They have to not talk about that when they're in any kind of official capacity. Look, if Governor Ivey were Jewish, well, if she were Jewish, she could have still read Isaiah and it would have meant about the same thing. If Governor Ivey were Muslim and she read an inspirational quote from the Quran, now there's a whole lot of stuff in the Quran that I do not agree with, but I wouldn't have been offended by Governor Ivey doing that. That's not something that would have bothered me, nor would I have said that she is in some kind of violation of the law. And the same thing goes true if she had read a quote from, say, Charles Darwin, or Richard Dawkins, or Mark Twain. By the way, not all of these people were atheists. In fact, Mark Twain specifically said that he was not. But when it comes down to it, my point is, I'm okay with looking at wisdom from other sources. It's funny that the Freedom from Religion Foundation, whose founder accuses other people of being closed-minded and not wanting to hear alternate opinions, is offended and has to send a letter threatening a lawsuit whenever he hears an opinion from an elected official that he disagrees with. All right, so what we're going to do is we have a guest coming up at the other side of this break, a friend of mine that's actually going to talk to us about our mental health during the coronavirus outbreak in this quarantine, and how to maintain a healthy mental outlook on the world. We go to that in just a minute on Tactics.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible with Pastor Gregory Post.
Welcome in. I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. And now it's time for a reading from the SJW Bible, the only Bible printed on 100% organic biodegradable paper. Today's reading comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 19, verses 3 through 10. And it says, Some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and asking, Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? And he answered and said, Have you not read on your Bible apps that he who created him from the beginning made them male and female, and trans, and pansexual, and non-binary, and Jupiter gender, or one of the 150 other options? And said, For this reason, a man/woman/other shall leave Z's father and mother, or father and father, or mother and mother, or two mothers, father, and their special friend Sequoia, and be joined to his wife, or wives, or husband, or life partners, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer 2 or 3 or 14, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. I mean, unless, of course, it's like super difficult, or there's money problems, or bedroom problems, or you meet somebody that you like better, or that initial spark goes away and you just fall out of love, or you're just unhappy for any reason. Then divorce is totally understandable. They said to him, "Why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away?" He said to them, "Because Moses wasn't woke enough. He was some rich, spoiled prince who was probably white and a tool of the patriarchy. So why do you care what he thinks? And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman, it's totally cool with God as long as you're happy. That is all God wants, after all." The disciples said to him, "That sounds super convenient. Thanks, Jesus." Wow. So inspirational. This has been a reading from the SJW Bible. And remember, the only truth that matters is your truth. And welcome back, everybody. Thanks so much for being with us here on Tactics on News Radio 1440. We appreciate you being with us through the break, and we do have a special treat for you today. We have a friend and colleague of mine that has agreed to do a guest spot for me and has been very generous with his time. You may remember about a week ago, one of the things that we talked about on the show was we had a physical fitness expert and somebody that helped us really maintain our physical fitness and our health while we're quarantined. Of course, that's a pretty big lifestyle change for everybody, so that can be difficult to do. But we thought it was equally important, and maybe even more important, to do the same thing with your mental health. So without further ado, I have on the phone Roxy Wishum, I think is the way to say that.
Thank you. Thanks, Caleb. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, thank you for being generous with your time. So one of the things that I wanted, and I kind of alluded to it in my introduction to you there, was to talk to you about some of the things that are going on and some of the mental health issues that could come up in this situation. But before we do that, I would like the audience, because I know you, but they don't know you, just
Sure.
talk a little bit about who you are and what you do for Faulkner and sort of your, prowess as a mental health counselor and how all that got started.
Okay. Thank you, Caleb. I am a mental health counselor in the counseling center at Faulkner University. I work with two other counselors there. Michelle Bond is the director of that counseling center. Phoebe Dunn also works with us. And we work with primarily college students, but we also provide counseling to faculty and staff at times. And it is it's an ongoing challenge. There at any given time, there's a significant portion of the population that is wrestling with some mental health issues. We find in the college population, anxiety and depression are high on the list. And so those are the kinds of things that we deal with a lot. And as you might expect, during the time of any kind of a crisis, those escalate.
Right. And so you could kind of speak generally on that if you wanted to, but also specifically with some of the things that are going on with the quarantine and people having to stay at home a lot more than they're used to, not being able to go out or socialize as much as they used to. What are some of the mental health issues that could crop up, maybe ones that had been either dormant and then just kind of rise to the surface because of this, or ones that could crop up just basically from the added stress that comes from this? What are some of those health issues?
Well, yes, thank you. That's some things just from being one of the wrestling matches that we have on an ongoing basis is determining whether we live by an internal or external locus of control, meaning does my happiness come from within me, or is my happiness determined by things that happen outside of me and happen to me? Mm-hmm. And it's important for us to develop an internal locus of control, but that's easier said than done. And in times like this, it feels like our freedoms are being taken away. And to some extent, that's true. You can't move about and do the things that you could do before. Mm-hmm. And we're in a more confined space. For some of us, we are confined with multiple people, maybe multiple generations of a family, maybe people that are not family. And that brings about challenges. Sure. And so those who've had some issues of domestic abuse in the past, who have emotional abuse issues, who have addictions to substances or pornography, the boredom and the confinement and the added stress can cause those things to come back to the surface. And so it certainly will be exaggerated by all that we're going through. There's no doubt that there will be an increase in that. And that's one of the concerns, I think, from a lot of people in the mental health profession, that the short-term and the long-term effects of what we're going through now, it's so different from what we've ever done before. And so those that, for example, if you have maybe you've had a slight problem with alcohol abuse and it hasn't been labeled or identified as such, well, that could really surface now, and it can become a strong habit that becomes something that causes problems within families, causes financial problems. So it can become a big issue where it may not have been in the past.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I was really concerned about. One of the things that you mentioned, the last part of that was alcoholism, alcohol abuse, and other addictions like pornography. That is really a concern with somebody that has a lot more idle time, especially somebody, I think that, there have been a lot of people that have either been furloughed or laid off, or people that get paid by the hour that maybe they still have their job, but they're not getting any pay right now because they can't work. And so you combine that with the extra spare time and like you said, boredom, that could be a really toxic combination.
It really can. And so the extra time and the boredom and the stress, especially stress from financial issues or pending financial issues, all of those can be like throwing gasoline on the fire. And so it really can accelerate mental health problems that maybe have been, as you said, dormant for a while, maybe never fully noticed. Maybe it's been a slight problem and no one has ever called you out on it. But it can become more and more of a problem during times of stress. That's one of the things that stress does, is it squeezes out the good in us, and it squeezes out the bad in us.
Well, I've never actually heard it described that way, but that's interesting. I could see how really both of those could be true. So one of the things that we've talked about is some of the issues that crop up because of this, or maybe rise to the surface. Are there any issues that could be formed specifically out of this? In other words, somebody that was mentally healthy beforehand that sort of develops a problem that wasn't really lying below the surface. Is that a possibility?
Well, it is, although I would say it probably is a matter of degree. And when I worked at pretrial diversion, that's a program for first-time felony offenders with the district attorney's office. I worked there for about 7 years. And one of the sections of counseling that we did in that program was anger management. And so we helped people work through the first stage of that. The first phase of anger management counseling is for people to come to the understanding that they have some anger that needs to be managed. And almost everybody's in denial about that. And so it's there. And so when we begin that, we'd have people keep an anger log, and they would make a notation of every time they became angry during a day. And they would do this for a week's time, and they'd come back together and we discuss it. And for so many of these, they would come back, almost everybody they would rank these on a scale of 1 to 10. Okay. And people would have 2s and 3s. It happened every time. Nobody ever had an 8 or 9 or 10. And some of these were people that clearly had anger issues, but they didn't recognize it. And so what they didn't understand is they were walking around at a 3 or 4 or 5 all the time. They were always angry at that level. So when they became angry and they thought they were going to a 3, they were actually going to an 8. And so the same thing applies, I think, with our levels of anxiety. Most of us think we're not very anxious. Most of us think we do not worry very much. And it's hard to say where the truth is. So it's hard for us, unless we have someone that's a really trusted confidant and someone that's an accountability partner, or you're talking to a counselor, then you probably don't know where your real level is. And so when you add these kinds of issues and anxiety stirs up, it may seem like it's going from a 0 or a 1 to a 3 or 4, but you may actually be going from a 4 to an 8. And that's true on all these realms that we're talking about. Any of us can escalate, and it can become a noticeable problem and a very visible problem to everybody around us. And sometimes, sadly, we're the last ones to recognize it.
Yeah, one thing that I have noticed in the very limited amount of dabbling into the mental health world and sort of looking at some of the things that they talk about, it seems as though awareness is a really big step. And that's something that is a lot harder to reach than most people realize.
Yes, it is. And so few of us have really good accountability partners.
Mhm.
Most of us have friends who desire to be our friends. And as such, they're going to tell you what they think you want to hear because they want to be your friend.
Right.
So to have someone that will tell you the truth when it's not a flattering truth, most of us don't have many of those kind of friends. And so that's the value of having a counselor, but it's also valuable to cultivate friendships and to be that kind of friend.
Well, I want to be very careful not to chase too many rabbits here, but you just touched on something that I've actually been thinking on quite a bit recently. I've noticed a movement in people of the millennial generation and the Gen Z generation, and I'm saying this as a millennial, that we tend to have a tendency to be sort of immutized to criticism, to the point to where if we do have a friend that is honest with us and tells us that we have a problem, we tend to the popular way to phrase that would be to cut the toxic people out of our life. And I think that's a really dangerous place to be, to where anybody that criticizes you or tells you you may not be 100% perfect, that we just want to jettison that relationship. I've been very concerned about that for a long time.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I would say, as a baby boomer, it's easy though for us to cast stones at that generation.
Sure.
The truth is, it's true of all generations, and it's so rare. I have a friend at church that some 5 or 6 years ago came to me and he said, "I want to ask a favor of you." And I said, "Okay." He said, "I'm asking you, I'm asking my employer, and I'm asking my wife to list 3 areas that I need to improve in, where I have shortcomings and I need to improve."
Mm-hmm.
And I won't go into all the details of that and how that unfolded, but I mentioned that just to say that is the grand total of all the people who've ever asked me to do that. One. I've lived 2/3 of a century, and one person has come up to me and asked me to do that. So it's not natural for us to invite criticism and to ask people to point out our shortcomings in areas where we need to grow, but it is very healthy. And athletes understand this. People in business understand this. They hire coaches and consultants to tell them where their shortcomings are. People that are in your business will hire image consultants. People who are writing books and want to go on tours will hire consultants. And so they will invite people to criticize them. Critique is a better word, I guess. And so we should be doing that in our daily lives. It's just, it doesn't come naturally. And we would rather hear the flattering things than the things that indicate I need work on myself.
Well, yeah, I think that's a natural human tendency. What about somebody, though, that in this quarantine, in the situation, is somebody like me that lives alone? What are some of the special issues that could crop up with that? Because, like you said, it'd be great to have a confidant and somebody that really cares about you, wants what's best for you, and is honest with you. But let's say you're somebody like me that is having to self-quarantine and doesn't really have somebody like that in the house. What are some of the things that we could do to kind of stave off any unforeseen mental health issues that could crop up in our situation?
That's a good point. But also there's a bright side. And the bright side in this case is you're sitting in a high-tech studio that you've put together and have a great computer system. I'm talking to you using an iPad. All of us have the ability to be connected, and today more than ever before. Now that's good news.
Sure,
and
bad. Yeah.
But the good news is we can use that. There are so many ways for us to connect with others. And in some ways, those hard conversations are easier over FaceTime or Google Meet or whatever than face to face. Face to face is better, and I certainly encourage that, and I miss that. But we can still stay socially connected even though we're physically distancing ourselves. And I think that's vitally important. And you bring up a good point that staying connected with people in this time is very important. And talking to real people and getting an input and sharing opinions with real people rather than relying on local and national news because they'll scare us to death if we watch that all the time. And so we need to talk to some people that are kind of sane and can be a little encouraging.
Yeah, speaking as someone who spends a great deal of his time because of work watching local and national news, I can attest to that.
Sure.
I mean, if that's all you focus on, that's going to drive you right
Yes.
up a wall. Uh,
Yes.
but we focused a lot on sort of the problems and observing the problems and some of the issues that can come up with it. Now I'd really like to focus on a few of the solutions because I know that you already mentioned staying connected and using technology as sort of a means to do that, which I think is helpful, and it's something that has personally helped me. I mean, I've already had several Bible studies over the internet since this thing started. Being able to communicate with people just through hanging out. I've been playing video games with some friends online, that kind of thing. But what are some of the other solutions? What are some things that a person that was watching this program could do to sort of limit their stress, their anxiety, and some of the other situations they might be dealing with in this?
Yeah, great question. And you mentioned one of them. You mentioned at the beginning of your show, the opening. You mentioned having someone on who was a physical fitness expert and talked about the importance of taking care of your health during this time. Well, I would say that applies. The same principles that apply with taking care of your physical health apply with taking care of your mental health, your emotional health, your spiritual health. And those basic principles are you have to do some of it every day, and we need to have some kind of routine. It doesn't have to be the same routine as we had before we were all confined to our homes, but there needs to be a little bit of a routine. Now,
Sure.
saying that, but I'm waking up much later than normal. I'm doing my morning run. Sometimes mid-morning, sometimes it's almost noon when I do the run that I used to do as the sun was coming up. So we can make adjustments, but we need to have some kind of routine. And the more routine we have, I think the more mentally healthy and emotionally healthy we'll be. And so diet, sleep, exercise, those things are the basics. They always are, but I think more so now. So if we don't watch that, there'll be some creep in all those areas. And I have posted several funny memes on my Facebook page about I offer my bathroom scales for sale the other day because they keep showing a different number every day. And other ways of being, I think having humor about the situation is good, but also being aware that we do, in fact, need to pay attention to, am I gaining a few pounds? And developing ourselves intellectually. If I don't, I've told myself for years that I'm so far behind on the stack of books that I have to read because I just don't have time. Well,
Sure.
I have time now. And so I'm doing some of that, and I'm still not doing that at the level that I would like to. But all of us need to be doing some things where we're developing ourselves intellectually and emotionally. And that's what will take care of our mental health. The mental health will follow if we'll just practice the discipline of doing things that we know we should be doing. Easier said than done. And that's where having an accountability partner, even if it's just someone you check in with through social media once or twice a week or maybe daily, I think having someone that's a good partner to sort of do this with, even if you're not physically with them.
Yeah, I think that that's even something that I've observed personally because just speaking from my own experience, the first, I don't know, week of this, which was spring break for us at the university, when all the students left, I basically just didn't have a plan. Like, I still did the show, so I had to do that every day. But other than that, I didn't have a whole lot of routine. And I found and granted, I'm still sleeping later than I normally do. But once I set an alarm to where I had to wake up at the same time every day, that actually made a surprising difference in my energy level and a whole bunch of other things. So, I think you're right that does help. In fact, I was reading a book recently by Jordan B. Peterson, who's a professor of psychology. And one of the things that he mentioned is that people discount the importance of routine because he said that he's had some patients that come to him that are at the level of psychosis that simply by getting a full night's sleep and eating a good breakfast in the morning, actually their anxiety drops down to pre-psychosis levels just by doing that.
Yes, no doubt. And that and bringing positive people into your life. That can be through reading. You can read books written by positive people, but also the people you're interacting with. And there's lots of that on social media. Now, you can go on social media and find some horrifying stories and some frightening stories of what's going to happen to the economy and how many thousands and tens of thousands are going to die. But you also
that's not on the internet. You can't find that anywhere on the internet.
But then my brother, who's a minister in South Georgia, he wrote a book called Journey to Joy some years ago, and it's based on the book of the Bible, Philippians. And so every day for 30 days now, he's doing a positive message that's pulled out of the book of Philippians and his writings. Mm-hmm. And it's just a positive message. It has some encouraging music that goes along with it, and it's maybe 5 minutes. So finding those kinds of things that provide some positive energy for us every day, that's feeding yourself mentally and emotionally a healthy diet, just like we need to do physically. You need to eat some fruits and vegetables. You need to intake some positive messages and some healthy and challenging messages.
Okay. Well, it sounds like a lot of this advice that you're giving is good advice, of course, for right now while we're in the quarantine, but it sounds like a lot of those habits it would be good to develop now so that we can carry them over into after all of this starts going back to normal.
It is absolutely true. And those who have done it the best, who have incorporated these as habits before, will fare the best during this time. And those who have not and who just sort of drifted are probably going to struggle the most. And so if we don't have that discipline, and if you're one of those people, find someone who does have that. And people are offering help, but they don't necessarily know how to contact you, or all of us tend to be a little reluctant to insert ourselves into the lives of someone else. But people want to help. And so if you're struggling with some of that, find someone you can just sit down and talk to. And I'm happy to be one of those. And I'm doing some of that with students via email and sometimes via Zoom sessions. And so we're still doing some of that. And it's good. That's rewarding to me. But that's a form of helping. And so that's one message also. Find a way to be a help to somebody else. You can cut somebody's grass. You can do something for somebody.
Well, I would assume with what you're talking about that there are quite a bit of people. Now, obviously, you're a counselor that works here at Faulkner University, but also that there would be quite a few mental health professionals around this area and around the state that are probably doing the same thing, meeting with clients and meeting with people over some kind of, Zoom or some similar app that does that. Just out of curiosity, and you may not, but do you know of any resources that a person could go to, maybe something that somebody could go to set up something if they feel like they maybe do have some mental health counseling needs?
Yeah. Yes, there are a number in the Montgomery area. Pike Road Counseling is one that we refer people to. Samaritan Counseling on Zelda Road. We send a lot of people there. It's a spiritual based, but very good licensed counselors. And so there are a number of that, and most of them are doing telehealth now. They're doing some form of online counseling. Okay. And they're struggling to meet the needs. And a lot of people that have been in that business for a while, been doing this for a while, if you're my age, the technology is new and it takes a little getting used to, but most have made that adjustment pretty quickly, and we're using it. And I think most people that are in the counseling profession are okay with laughing at themselves and saying, well, I didn't do that very well. Let's back up and try it again. So yes, there are lots of counselors in the area, and again, Samaritan, that's on Zelda Road, right in the middle of Montgomery, and Pike Road Counseling, that's out near the intersection of Vaughn Road and Pike Road. Those are good people and good businesses to go to.
Well, excellent. Just to kind of open up the floor to you, is there anything that you would like to tell our audience in this time? Is there anything that maybe I wouldn't have thought to ask about, or maybe I would have left out? Is there anything that you'd want to convey that maybe we missed?
Well, actually, I think, Caleb, your questions have been very well directed, and I don't have a lot to add. Maybe just to emphasize again, to learn to look for the positive. There's always a bright side. Everything, the darkest clouds have a bright side. In fact, it took me a good many decades to finally come to the realization that the most beautiful sunrises and the most beautiful sunsets are those where there's some clouds. And the clouds are what cause the contrast and the varying colors. And that's what makes the most beautiful sunrises and sunsets. So it's Times of life when there's trouble, that's when some of the best beauty can emerge. And I'm seeing that in people now. So I would encourage people to look for that. Look for the helpers, look for the people that are doing beautiful things and good things and kind things, and be one of those people. Emulate those people, attach yourself to people that are doing good things. And if you're doing for others, and if you're feeling and expressing gratitude for what is in your life, you'll do fine. You'll be fine during this time, and that's during any time. If you have an attitude of gratitude and you develop positive thinking and you look for the bright side, life will be good.
Yeah, I think that that's a skill that people really need to be able to learn and understand, because that's something that is prevalent, of course, throughout the scripture. I mean, everywhere. That some of the best stories of human triumph, of people coming to know God and to being able to understand themselves, typically all of that happens when things are really, really bad in the world. I mean, the greatest blessing that God ever gave mankind came through an innocent man being tortured to death. That's a pretty dark way for the greatest blessing to come through. And so I think that there's a lot of truth to what you were saying there.
And interestingly, we're in the week where that's traditionally celebrated, the week of.
Well, that's true. I didn't even think about that, but yeah.
And so it is the very time that Jesus was going through that and headed, a few days ago, this time he would have been coming into Jerusalem with celebration and acclaim, and then criticized and judged and beaten and ultimately crucified. And so we're leading up to the day of the week that would have happened for him. And so, yes, we're in that exact time, which is maybe there's some irony there. And so there's good there. And obviously great good came out of that terrible time. And it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes we can have bad times and we don't see the good or cause the good to come out of it. But God's promised us that all things work together for good. If we love him and follow him and try to do what he has instructed us to do, good will come out of even what seems to be bad times. And I believe that's the case with this virus and the ramifications of that virus as well.
Well, I certainly do too. Thank you so much, Roxy, for being with us. Roxy Wishum, who is a counselor, a mental health counselor here at Faulkner University. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Caleb.
All right. We'll see you later. And we'll take a quick break here, and we'll be back in just a moment.
Hey, where you going? Champ? Slugger? Hey, cowboy. Where you going? Where you going?
I'm going out!
All right, here we are. So you guys remember last year, one of the things I talked about in a segment called Straw Wars is how the liberals, despite no scientific evidence or backing whatsoever, believe that somehow they are saving the sea life by banning plastic straws. In response to this, Mellow Mushroom has started giving out paper straws as opposed to plastic straws. So what we're going to do is we're going to see how effective the paper straws are with the most difficult drink to drink, a milkshake. Let's see how this stands up. All right, so first of all, I got about 2 sips out of that, and the paper stuck to my lips. This thing does not work too well. Boy, it'd take you 2 hours to drink this with this.
Well, see, I'm using plastic.
That's John from Millbrook, by the way. He's
I
the one
don't care.
driving.
I think they use plastic because that's the best thing to use.
This thing sucks. Well, actually, it doesn't suck. If it sucked, I'd be fine with it, but it doesn't. This milkshake will melt before I finish this. All right. Experiment over. It's biodegradable. All right. We're going to fix this now. There we go. Good old petroleum-based plastic straws. Oh, that's so much better.
I got a question about this.
Oh yeah?
With the paper, aren't they concerned about the trees, having to cut down the trees to make the straws too? Is that not a...
Well, that's one of the points that I made. It doesn't matter what you make the straw out of. You're expending some kind of resource.
Well, yeah, because we all live here.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, it doesn't matter what you make any product out of. You're expending some kind of resource. Mm-hmm. And that's true of straws or anything else. Well, I tell you this. Just based on this little experiment, I know that I saw that Disney is planning to go completely paper straw by 2020 on all their cruise lines and all of their amusement parks. I contend that Disney World is not the happiest place on earth if I can't drink a Dead Blame milkshake while I'm there.
But I will, to their defense, say one thing.
Oh?
You can take a pocket knife in. So help me.
That's something.
Yeah.
Anyway, alright, so even though this went about the way I expected it to, paper straw experiment failed miserably. I imagine if I had left it in there much longer, it would have dissolved. I had a buddy the other day that went to a place that used paper straws. He said he had to order 6 different straws throughout the course of his meal because they kept dissolving on him. Which I'm sitting there thinking, you can't tell me that using 1 plastic straw is worse for the environment than 6 paper straws. I mean, that's just common sense. Anyway, alright, thanks guys. I'm going to enjoy the rest of my milkshake.
No, you messed it up. You're stupid.
And for... Oh, something's wrong with my headset there. There we go. Okay. For today's Daily Dose of Stupid, if I can get my sound working here. That's going to drive me crazy. There we go. All right, so for today's Daily Dose of Stupid, sorry for that little interruption. Today is really an example of a stupid person that for whatever reason some people continue to listen to. And we have these people all over the place that for whatever reason, they just, I don't understand why people take them seriously. I don't know why people continue to listen to their opinions on things that they are obviously severely underqualified to speak about. It's not that there's anything wrong with them speaking out about it. I mean, I believe in freedom of speech as much as anybody. But I also don't understand why other people actually take their opinions as though they're meaningful. That's the part that I have a real problem with, especially when we're talking about celebrities, actors, actresses, so on and so forth. People like that have no more qualification to discuss the issues of the day than any average person walking around on the street, probably less, honestly. And yet, for whatever reason, their opinions are taken as though they're incredibly important and people want to hear them. That's the thing that I find odd about it. I don't think that it's wrong, I just think it's strange. But nonetheless, as usual, when one of these people talks, they spout out a bunch of nonsense that doesn't make any sense. And today's example, Alyssa Milano, is no different. To understand the importance of the 2 clips that we're going to play for you real quick here, this was an interview done on Radio Andy on Sirius XM. And this particular interview, Alyssa Milano, who has been for quite some time now a leader of the Me Too movement. I don't know if she's actually involved in the organization itself in the sense that she actually helps organize things, but I know that she's been a donor to some of those causes. She's been an outspoken advocate for the movement. Alyssa Milano, just the other day, was on this interview, and she was asked about, because something happened and everything kind of blew up on Twitter, that there seemed to be an inconsistency with the way that she went after people like Brett Kavanaugh and Roy Moore and other conservatives under the banner of Me Too, and didn't do the same for Joe Biden, who now has been accused of sexual assault, and she has now endorsed as president. And she gives an answer, and I do want you to keep an open mind with this, think through it, and we're going to give you, of course, my commentary on this as well, but this was her response to that question about all of the people on Twitter giving her grief about having a double standard when it came to Joe Biden, whom she has endorsed as president and she is friends with. So we'll go ahead and play that now.
I have not publicly said anything about this. If you remember, it kind of took me a long time to publicly say anything about Harvey as well. Okay. Because I believe that even though we should believe women, and that is an important thing, and what that statement really means is, like, you know, for so long the go-to has been not to believe them. So really we have to sort of societally change that mindset to believing women, but that does not mean at the expense of not giving men their due process and investigating situations.
I like that.
And giving, it's got to be fair in both directions. So we have to find this balance in the Believe Women movement, and also giving men their due process, and realizing that we're destroying lives if we publicly don't go through the right steps in order to find out if an accusation is credible or not.
Okay, so what's so great about that is she comes up with this answer, which, by the way, taken on its head and taken in a vacuum, like if you took out that Alyssa Milano said that and just put a script and wrote it down, and I read it, didn't know who it was, didn't understand the context, I don't think there's a single word that she said that I would disagree with the exception of, I take a little bit of issue with, well, the default has been to not believe women. I gotta say, personally, in my experience, I've not met a whole bunch of people that would dismiss a woman claiming that she's been sexually assaulted by somebody. I mean, maybe out in California, that's how they roll, but just here in the South, I mean, one woman claims that there's somebody that has sexually assaulted her, and you get people that are pretty much ready to put together a mob to go out and talk to the guy. So I that hasn't been my experience, but ignoring that little tidbit of information or disinformation, whatever it may be, what I find more astounding about that is that she says, well, the thing is, there are good things in the Me Too movement, and I do think that we need to believe women, but we also want to balance that with due process. And I'm like, wow, due process, man. That is a fantastic point, Alyssa Milano. And I genuinely wish that before all these sexual assault allegations and rape allegations and allegations against men in the public sphere came out, that there had been, like, I don't know, maybe somebody that had come up with that earlier. That would have been really great, because if we had that idea beforehand, then maybe we would have had a little bit more even, we would have had a little bit more fairness for the people that were accused. Except when all that was going on between people like Roy Moore, Brett Kavanaugh, and including people that I didn't necessarily like, people like Al Franken and Harvey Weinstein, I came up with that, and I brought it up during when all those things were going on. And it wasn't just me, it was a whole bunch of people on the right and also some on the left. And then even before those people came up with that talking point, there was the idea of due process that was enshrined in our Constitution. So the idea that somebody came up with that beforehand, okay, just about 230 years before Alyssa Milano did. So I guess it's fair to say she's a little late to the party on that one, but I'm just so excited I'm knocking my microphone around like it's the first day in the studio. I just love that, and I also love how her example to basically prove that she's consistent, like, oh no, this is not the first time I've done this. This is not the first time I've wanted to give a man a fair shake when it comes to accusations of me too. You'll remember that I held off on talking about Harvey Weinstein. Yes, Harvey Weinstein, who was also a Hollywood insider, a bigwig in your industry. So you would have had ample motivation to stay quiet about him regardless of how he felt or how you felt about him or how he was politically. But on top of that, he's also a big Democrat donor. So her big example of how, no, this isn't because I just like the guy or I'm endorsing him or want to vote for him. Remember, I did the same thing with Harvey Weinstein, who was one of Hillary Clinton's biggest donors. If you want to show your consistency, you're going to have to do a little bit better than, but I held off on Harvey Weinstein. I mean, to put that into context, that would be like me saying, with News Radio 1440, oh, okay, yes, I'm being very hard on Milo Yiannopoulos right now, but you might want to remember that, when I held off on Mark Levin. Well, yeah, but Mark Levin agrees with me on most things, and so it's just a stupid example of her trying to make this case that she is consistent. Basically, what I got out of that statement was believe all women until they accuse men that you like. If you like the guy, you agree with the guy's politics, then you don't necessarily have to believe the woman. Because you'll remember, she was on the front lines when it came to Kavanaugh. She did this to a degree with Roy Moore, but with Kavanaugh, she was actually in Washington. She actually showed up to the confirmation hearings. She was the guest and was in the room when this was happening, was cheering it on, was basically the one calling off with his head, wanting him to go ahead and be dismissed immediately because these allegations were here, without a shred of proof. And to compare these two, this is the really funny thing, because here's the thing. I don't know whether or not Joe Biden actually sexually assaulted anyone. Based on the little bit of evidence that I've seen, and I haven't seen very much, it doesn't seem as though she has a very strong case. But one big difference in the woman that is accusing Joe Biden and the women that accused, for example, Brett Kavanaugh or Judge Roy Moore, is that we can actually prove that his accuser did know Joe Biden, which seems to be a pretty big step in thinking that the allegations might be credible. When it came to the three main ones, but there were actually about a dozen other women that accused Brett Kavanaugh, we couldn't even prove that they ever met the man. And when it came to the accusations with Roy Moore, there were a couple of women that he even admitted that he knew them and he had met them at one point, but the only one that had accused him of doing something that was actually a crime, they couldn't prove that they ever met him or had ever run into him or been an acquaintance of him. None of the ones that accused him of an actual crime, the ones that would have been under the legal age for him to have, done anything with them, and the ones that didn't even claim that he had done anything with them, which is also very telling. But when it came to those cases, you couldn't even prove that the accusers ever met the person they were accusing. So automatically, Joe Biden's accusers have at least a little more credibility than that, where there's not even a shred of evidence. And somehow, all of a sudden, when the accuser is accusing a man that she likes, a person that she politically agrees with and also has a friendship with, now all of a sudden due process is really super important to Alyssa Milano. It's just so abundantly transparent. And I love that little tagline at the end. She's like, well, we have to understand that if we just believe the women without giving the man a fair hearing, without giving him due process, what we are doing there is we are ruining lives. Well, you sure as heck didn't mind ruining Brett Kavanaugh's life. You weren't real concerned with that. You weren't coming out on national public radio and saying, I think that we have to consider here that Brett Kavanaugh and Roy Moore, they're people too, and maybe we should not just excoriate them or try to drag their name through the mud, realizing that these are, lives that we're ruining and we don't have any evidence to back it up. I don't remember her taking this measured response where she was so concerned with fairness when it came to those two. Here's the next clip where she's at a different point in this interview talking about this as well.
Right. I did my work and I spoke to Time's Up, and I just don't feel comfortable throwing away a decent man that I've known for 15 years.
Yep.
In this time of complete chaos without there being a thorough investigation.
Yep.
I'm sure that mainstream media would be jumping all over this as well if they
we weren't in a pandemic. Or if there was more, credible, if there was evidence that was.
If they found more evidence or through their investigation. So I'm just kind of staying quiet about it.
Right, because the media has no motivation whatsoever to handle the Roy Moore and the Kavanaugh cases differently than Joe Biden. They couldn't possibly have a motivation for treating those guys one way and Joe Biden another way, since he seems to be the only hope left to defeat Trump when it comes to the Democrat Party. There's no reason that the media would be lobbing him softball questions. I was watching something that I believe it was Newsbusters, and it was that organization, which is sort of a conservative watchdog group. They looked over 3 or 4 days worth since the news had broke that there were allegations against Joe Biden, and Joe Biden had done, if I'm not wrong, he had done 18 different media interviews in the days after that taking place. And what was really hysterical about that is one of those public appearances was a 2-hour-long CNN town hall where somehow that just didn't come up. Yeah, the media isn't protecting Joe Biden. Just like Donna Brazile with CNN, slipping answers to Hillary Clinton before the debate, just like the fact that there have been countless research studies done to show that the vast majority of people in the mainstream media actually do vote Democrat, lean left, so on and so forth. But they couldn't possibly have a motive for not covering Joe Biden's allegations. And I love that that's her backstop. That's like, yeah, well, the media, they would be covering this more in depth if there was actually any credibility to it. Here's the thing. Even if the media were actually impartial, let's just pretend for a second we lived in an ideal world where journalists actually did their job and didn't have any bias. Now, I don't think that's even possible as human beings, because we all inherently have some kind of bias, and I understand that. But let's just pretend that that was not the case, that every journalist on Earth and every news outlet on Earth had absolutely no bias one way or the other, left or right. Them not covering it would still not be a good reason for not believing it. This is one of the things that's so infuriating, especially with people on the left, is that they assume that because the media and their buddies on the left in the media say something, then it's gospel. And if they don't say it, it must be because there's just not a story there. This is how you get to a country that is this radically divided. That one side watches their preferred cable news network and the other side watches their preferred cable news network, never gets any feedback from anybody from the other side, and when they say something, they just assume that it's not true because they didn't see it, so it must not exist. That's what Alyssa Milano is. She is a caricature almost of a person that lives inside an ivory tower, and if the people that she's talking to didn't say it, that must not be true. There's a great anecdotal story about some kind of New York bigwig that was talking to one of his friends after Ronald Reagan got elected, And he said, Ronald Reagan won the election. He says, that's not possible. I don't know anybody that voted for Ronald Reagan. That's the ivory tower these people live in. They assume that because the mainstream media is not covering it, there must not be nothing. There must not be anything to it. My buddies in the media, my buddies in the left, if it were important, if there was anything to it, they'd be covering it. Even if they were unbiased, it's not a good idea to delegate your thinking to another individual. Even if it's a good person, even if it's somebody that you like. That's why on this program, I don't do that to you. I never asked you, nor will I ever ask any of you, to just listen to me, take my word for it, don't do your own research, don't look at for your own information, just listen to me and believe me. I'm not asking anyone to do that. And if you did do that, even if it were me, that would be a very foolish thing to do. Don't absolve yourself of the responsibility of thinking for yourself and making your own decisions and doing your own research. Don't pass that off onto somebody else, no matter how good they are, because they're a flawed individual. They're a human being. And Alyssa Milano is basically in that saying, well, I don't have to do my own thinking on this. The media, if it becomes a big deal, they'll cover it and they can do my thinking for me. That's what's going on there. And I would like to say that this is something that is relegated to only the left or only Hollywood, but unfortunately a lot of Americans fall into that trap as well. Alyssa Milano is a glaring example of stupidity for doing it. And I don't think that the average American has anywhere near the level of lack of self-awareness that it took to create this double standard between men that she likes that are being accused of sexual assault and men that she doesn't like that are being accused of sexual assault. But on this one particular area of building herself an ivory tower to where she only hears opinions that confirm what she already believes, unfortunately, I think a lot of Americans are in that place right now. But if you were wondering, that clip that we just heard really confirms what we kind of thought we heard implied in the first clip, which is basically, I've been friends with Joe Biden for 15 years, and so of course I believe him. Does she not remember that when accusations were coming out against Brett Kavanaugh, that there was a tsunami of women, both from his time in college, his time after college, staffers that had worked for him when he was a federal judge, people like his wife, his family. Now, granted, you could say that they all had a vested interest in saying that because, you know, they like Brett Kavanaugh and he's somebody that's a friend of theirs or an acquaintance of theirs. But they would be the people that know him, so they would be the ones that would be in a best position. And I'm not saying just because a person has people that like them or that will vouch with them that automatically makes them innocent. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying in the absence of any actual evidence that something like that took place, why is it that Alyssa Milano thinks that her personal experiences with Joe Biden basically wiped the slate clean and she doesn't even have to consider whether or not this actually took place? But when it comes to Brett Kavanaugh, with no evidence at all, she just kind of ignores all the women that vouched for him. The same thing with Roy Moore. Obviously, it was on a smaller scale because that was a local election, but the same kind of thing. That all of a sudden, when women come to the defense of these people, it's really, really important, and we should really be listening and taking heed to their anecdotal stories when it's someone Alyssa Milano likes. But we should just disregard that if it's somebody that she didn't likes. To be clear, and sort of to wrap all this up into a nice little package, I think that Alyssa Milano's standard is fair. I think that's actually what we should do with every person that is being accused of something like that. I think that you believe the woman in the sense that you don't necessarily believe everything she says is true, but you take her seriously and you look into it yourself and you wait and see what the evidence says and you follow the evidence where'er it leads and give people their due process and realize that you don't want to ruin a person's life, especially on something that may or may not be true until you know for sure that it is. I think that's a fair standard. My question is, where the heck was this Melissa Alano when it came to Brett Kavanaugh when she was a screaming banshee, literally, inside the hearings saying that we have to cast this man out? look, I get that she disagrees with a lot of things that Brett Kavanaugh may or may not agree with. I've said for a long time, I'm not convinced that he's actually super pro-life or anything like that. Let's just assume that he was. And Alyssa Milano didn't want him on the court because she was afraid that he was going to overturn Roe v. Wade. I haven't really seen any evidence of that. I hope that he does, but I haven't seen any evidence of it. If that were the case, and that were her rationale, and that's why she said, and this is why we can't let this man sit on the Supreme Court, I disagree with her, but at least she's being honest. I disagree with her, but at least she's not trying to ruin the man personally. She's just saying, I have a difference of political opinion with him, and that's why I don't like him. That's not what happened. She called him a rapist for an accusation with less evidence than Joe Biden and said that he should be kicked off the court for that, not because she had a political disagreement with the man. That's the double standard that I can't stand. That's the double standard that is on big, glaring display here. And so when she calls for due process, I will join Alyssa Milano on those calls. But I have a feeling the next time a prominent conservative winds up getting accused that it's going to be exactly the same thing that Alyssa Milano did with Brett Kavanaugh, because her standard is, do I like the guy? Yes. Okay, then the allegations probably aren't true. And unfortunately, that's where a lot of people in the political sphere and also in the entertainment sphere, that's where they are. There is a glaring double standard here, and the reason that she is the subject of our Daily Dose of Stupid today is because she has a massive, obvious double standard, and she's too dumb to even realize it. Let's go to the Chaplain's Report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Our Chaplain's Report today comes from the book of 1 Samuel, and we've been studying in this book a little bit, but I know that I'm going out of order here, but I love the story that 1 Samuel opens with, and one of the great heroines of the Bible, arguably my favorite heroine in the Bible, Hannah, it gives her story and talks about her faith, and it's just, I know that I'd already given some material that was after this story, but I had to go back and discuss this since we started this series on 1 Samuel. So, to understand what is going on in this scene, Elkanah, and I believe that's how to pronounce his name, I'm not a Jewish scholar, and his two wives, one of which is named Hannah, used to go to sacrifice every year at this particular temple, and this was a annual tradition. They did it every year, and Hannah is barren and the other wife is not. And as you can imagine, that causes a great deal of tension between her, to the point that she actually uses the word and refers to the other wife as her adversary, which I think is hilarious, because I don't know if it's the same Hebrew word used here, but that's the same word that the Bible uses, at least in English, to describe the devil. So I don't know if that's actually what she was calling him, but it seems as though it's the same word, at least based on my English translation. So I do find that quite amusing, that she refers to her as the adversary, and that may actually be her referring to her the same as the devil himself, which I would have found hysterical reading that. But beyond that, I do think that one thing that we have to take note of here, and I get people that are skeptics of the Bible talk about this all the time, that the Bible is a endorsed polygamy. And I'm just sitting there like, have you not read the Bible? Because yes, there are Bible heroes that engaged in polygamy. Can you point to one where it actually worked out well for him? Where the Bible has actually something nice to say about polygamy? Because I don't. And other characters in this same book of 1 Samuel are a glaring example of that. But here's another example of somebody that it doesn't give a whole lot of information on, but we hear about him having two wives, and the only thing that we know about that relationship and the health of that relationship is that one of the wives is so angry at the other one that she refers to her as the adversary. And that's just a relationship that never works. It never can. The Bible doesn't endorse polygamy. In fact, it doesn't seem to ever have anything nice to say about it. It only casts it, so far as I'm aware, in a very negative light. It either stays silent on it or has some pretty awful commentary on it. It doesn't really speak very highly of that kind of relationship at all. And so what's fascinating about this is when these two wives are going at it, Hannah, of course, being barren, they go to the sacrifice every year, and Hannah goes to this particular sacrifice this year that we have recorded in the book of 1 Samuel, and this is how she reacts to going down. If you'll look at 1 Samuel 1, 9 through 11, where it reads, "Then Hannah rose after eating and drinking in Shiloh. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat by the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She, greatly distressed, prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. She made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on my affliction of your maidservant and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and a razor shall never come on his head." And of course, with hindsight, we understand that the child that was born there, her prayers were answered, and she did have a son, and she did dedicate him to the Lord, and kept everything in the vow that she made in that prayer, and the boy's name was Samuel. But let's look, without thinking too much about the result and looking at it with too much hindsight, let's look at the content of that prayer. Where does that prayer strike you? What are some of the observations that you make about it? Because based on the context of the story, based on the way that the Bible is explicit in explaining that this was an annual thing that this family did, that they made this annual pilgrimage to this temple, and hearing this prayer by Hannah, you think this is attempt number one? Because I tend to not. And I don't think that I'm making any kind of big biblical example or logical leap here. I think it's pretty darn obvious that what is going on here is that this woman, Hannah, has been praying for a child for a very, very long time. Now, we don't know. We don't know how old Hannah is. We don't know how old her husband is. We don't know how long they've been married. We don't know how long she's been dreaming of it. A lot of women then, just like a lot of women now, dream about being a mom their entire lives. But even if we're just taking the timetable out of it, it's safe to assume that this is not something that's only been going on a couple years. This has probably been going on for a really, really long time. How long, we're not sure. But that's every indication coming not only from the way that the scripture reads in describing the story, the lead up to it, but also the way she talks about in this prayer that, God, if you remember me and if you give me this child, then I will make a vow that he will be a Nazarene. You know, maybe a woman on her first attempt at praying to God for a child would do something like that, but it doesn't seem likely. It seems to me what's going on here, and I don't think that the danger in a prayer like this, I think, is that you start thinking about God as a giant space gumball machine, that you just do exactly the right thing and make a bargain with him and say, God, if you'll do this for me, I'll do this for you. I don't think that that's the message that the prayer is giving. I think the reason that that is included in here is because it shows Hannah's desperation. I think God had intended to grant her a son at some point regardless, but this request, I don't think, is what convinced God to go ahead and give her a child because he wanted to have the child from. I don't think that's the message that it's giving at all. The message that I do think that it is trying to convey is this is a person that has been praying desperately for years on end for this blessing and hasn't had it answered. And I think that's something that is just so relatable. That despite being really similar to Hannah in no way whatsoever, except the fact that I too have had certain things that I've prayed for that just God never seems to answer me on, or never seems to answer in the way that I want him to. I think that that's a way that we can see Hannah even today as somebody that's very relatable. And I think that everybody has had something similar to that happen to them. That you just keep praying and keep praying and keep praying and don't understand why it's not working. And so because of that, I want to try to deconstruct this and get inside Hannah's head a little bit. What did Hannah tell herself when her prayers weren't answered? And again, since this is such a human relatable story, I think the smartest way to do that is to ask ourselves, if we were in this position, how would we react? What would our reaction have been to something like this? Because just being perfectly honest, I know what mine would have been. There's about 6 or 7 different options that I can think of that would have been pretty similar to what I would have said. But one thing that I can think of is, in Hannah's position, maybe God just doesn't want me to have a baby. Now, of course, I'm going back to Hannah specifically because, I'm a guy, and regardless of what every liberal in California might tell you, I can't do that. But in Hannah's case, she's there thinking, maybe this just isn't something that God wants for me. Maybe this is something that's going to always go unanswered. Maybe this is just not who I am, and this isn't what God wants for me. And you know what? Maybe she would have been right. I'm sure there were women, not only throughout biblical times, but now, that pray for a child and don't understand why that never comes to pass. And maybe God's plan for those women is not for them to have children. Maybe he wants them to serve him in a different way. I don't know. But that's not an unfair way to think about it. Maybe Hannah is thinking, maybe I'm being punished for something that I did. Maybe I made a mistake, and because I have sinned, and because that's something that, I have to work out spiritually, that I can't do that. And I know that that's something that I've thought about with certain sins, that I'm being punished for something, that there are real world ramifications, not necessarily something that God sent down upon me or whatever, but that this blessing has been withheld from me because I'm having a hard time getting this sin out of my life. Maybe she thought that God knows I'm just not ready to be a mom. Maybe God is holding out on me because this is going to be answered later, and I'm just upset that it hasn't shown up yet, and I'm getting impatient. Maybe that was Hannah's mentality. I don't know. I just know that that's something that I've thought about before, regardless of what it was that I was praying for, that, maybe God doesn't want this for me right now, or maybe I'm being held back because there's something else I have to do first, and I don't know what that is. And then I think one that is incredibly common amongst people when the prayer isn't answered. Maybe God's not there. Maybe God isn't answering me because God isn't there. Whether it's he's not there in the sense that he's just not listening to me, or he's not there in the sense that God isn't real. Maybe my prayers haven't been answered because God isn't there to answer them. Now, up until now, every suggestion that I've given to you is not one that would necessarily be incorrect in certain circumstances. This one, of course, would be. But I think it illustrates how we can sort of have a crisis of faith, and that our faith can be shaken because we have the wrong idea about God. Because I think there's a lot of people that would default to that last one that I read first. That they wouldn't think, maybe God has a good reason for this, or maybe there's something that I'm just not getting right now. Maybe God is holding back because he knows that I'm not ready yet for this blessing, or whatever it is that I'm asking for him to do. But regardless of that, that last question is fundamentally different. Because what that does is it puts the responsibility back on God and says that God is the problem, not me. That's where I really think the error is. And with the other suggestions of maybe I'm not ready yet, maybe there's some kind of sin that I need to get out of my life before that this can take place. Maybe it's something that I don't realize that I'm doing to myself. Regardless of what it is, regardless of the reason that that blessing is being held back and the reason that God is saying no, ultimately, where faith comes in is that we have faith that God knows better than us. That if God's answer for something is no, he must have a good reason. If God's answer is something that we don't like, there's got to be a good reason out there. You know, it's hard not to connect this in some ways with everything that's going on in the country right now. That maybe the reason that we've asked for pardon or asked for this plague to pass over us without really doing any harm either to us physically or our families or this country or our economy or whatever it may be, and God says no, maybe there's a good reason for that. And I think a good analogy here would be to understand, as the Bible illustrates so many times, God is a father. You know, when you're a little kid, 4 or 5, in your mind, there's never a good reason to get a shot. Never. There is nothing that an adult could do for the average 4 or 5-year-old. Maybe there are some exceptions that I'm just unaware of. But for the average kid, you're not going to be able to convince them through a series of logical arguments why it is essential that they get a shot. You're just not going to be able to do that. So why do kids do it? Well, granted, there are probably some kids that they basically just have to hold them down and give them the shot. But the reason that I think probably on average most kids don't, that they, even though they may cry, they may squirm, they may wince, they're willing to do so when they get around that age, is not because they understand. It's because their parents do. It's because when their mom or dad tells them that it is in their best interest to do that, they take it on faith that the parent is smarter than them. And usually that's because they have learned through experience that that is a good policy to have. Like when mom and dad say, don't stick the key in the light socket, we usually learn through experience why they're telling us not to do that. When they say, don't put your hand on that, it's hot, and then we do it and it burns, normally that is a teaching moment to where the kid learns, maybe mom and dad know what they're talking about after all, and I should listen to them. And that's why when a kid gets to a certain age, 6, 7, 8, something like that, they still don't like it. And in their mind, there's still not a reason good enough to justify them getting a shot. They take it on faith that their parents' wisdom is superior to their own. They know that their parents love them. They know that their parents want what's best for them. They know that their parents have always done everything to protect them. So if they're asking me to do this thing that I really hate, that hurts so much, they've got to have a good reason. So even though I don't like it, I'll go through with it. See, that's the reason that I think Jesus tells us to come to him as a little child. That we have faith that whatever the reason, whatever the answer is, whatever it is that we pray for, if God comes back and says no, the way to have that kind of faith that Jesus asks us to have is to remember that God's our Father and his wisdom is just better than ours. That if you're asking him for a child or a mate or a better job or this or that or whatever else it may be, and God's answer comes back and it's a big fat no, that God's not giving you that no because he doesn't like you or doesn't care about you. God is coming back with that no because he can see things that you can't. He understands things that you don't understand. And if he comes back with a no, there's a darn good reason for it. In the same way that if a little kid asks, Mom, can I just not get this shot? And the mom responds no, They don't like that answer. They know that that answer is going to cause them pain, but ultimately they believe that that answer really must be in their best interest because my mom who loves me would not ask me to do this if she didn't have a really, really good reason. That's the kind of childlike faith we should strive for. But there's one last observation I want to make before we close out. When it comes to Hannah, did the prayers ever stop? We're given no indication that they are because, like I said, it seems to me this is a person that has been praying for a really, really long time for this to take place, and they keep coming, and they keep coming, and they keep coming. Hannah keeps getting a no. She keeps praying. This seems like a prayer that she's probably prayed 1,000 times. Maybe not in this exact way, but I'm just saying in general, a prayer to have a child. I imagine a person that is faithful as Hannah, a person that has done this every year. This is a prayer that she's done so many times, she's probably sick of it. And I think that the lesson for us in that is, just because God is saying no right now doesn't mean he won't say yes later. Maybe he's waiting for the opportune time for something in his divine plan. Maybe he's waiting for the opportune time because it's what benefits us. Maybe he's waiting for the opportune time because it benefits somebody else. Or maybe he's saying no because there is no opportune time, and whether we understand it or not, there's a reason that there is a no coming down the pike, and it will always be that way. That happens sometimes. I get that. I've been in that situation. But remember that he said no to Hannah an awful lot, and there are probably some women that asked this their entire lives and never got the answer, but God still took care of them, and he still knew what was best for them. And ultimately, him saying no didn't inhibit his relationship with some of them either. When it comes down to it, we don't know the reason that God gave Hannah a no. We've speculated. We've talked about some of the options. We've talked about some of the things that we would do if we were in Hannah's position. But ultimately, we don't know because we're not given an answer. And neither was Hannah. Yet despite the fact that Hannah never figured out why God was doing this, the scripture never tells us. And yet, she doesn't seem real concerned with all that once her blessing is actually rewarded. Like, she doesn't come back and like, you know, God, I'm super glad that you finally gave me this child, but why? What was the hang up? You see, as Christians, we understand that there is an eternal reward coming as long as we obey the scripture and do what God asks of us. And when that comes, yeah, there's going to be an awful lot of no's, and maybe we do even ask. Maybe we even are curious about that. I don't know, but frankly, I think by the time we get there, we're just not going to care anymore. Just like Hannah with Samuel, once that baby's there, she doesn't really care what the answer was. She's just glad that that blessing came her way. I think that's the kind of faith that we can emulate. Stay the course, friends. Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media or our business partners. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Video production by Jackson Dean. Broadcast studio provided by Faulkner University. Location studio provided by